This week, we'll be looking at how to analyze arguments. As always, I recommend that you have the slides nearby so that you can fill out the blanks as we progress through the lecture, and also so you can take notes on any content that is not presented in the slides. Let's start by looking at the foundation of an argument. That is, the parts that make up an argument. First off, an argument is when one or more statements, known as premises, are used to support a conclusion. The objective of an argument is to change someone's view, belief, or attitude through reasoning. Arguments are sometimes referred to as the giving of reasons, and that is because arguments are essentially the reasons why a person should come to the same conclusion as you. If you can't identify at least one premise and at least one conclusion, it is not an argument. And we'll discuss what premises and conclusions are in terms of arguments next. The objective, again, of an argument is to change someone's view, belief, or attitude into a new view, belief, or attitude through the process of reasoning. The premises are the why part of an argument. Premises can be matters of fact, matters of opinion, or both. Premise indicators or premise markers are terms that generally mean that the premise is going to follow. There is a full list of premise indicators in your textbook on pages 234 to 235. Some examples of premise indicators are words like because, for, given, seeing that, whereas, and secondly. These terms generally mean that the premise, the why, is coming next. In contrast, conclusions are the what part of an argument. Conclusions are essentially a belief or a point of view that is supported or defended by premises. Conclusion indicators or conclusion markers are similar to premise indicators or markers, except in this case, these terms indicate that a conclusion is likely to follow. The full list of conclusion indicators can be found in your textbook on page 234. Some examples include therefore, hence, so, consequently, as a result, and thus. Conclusions are often easier to identify than premises, so it's a good idea to start there, and once you've located the conclusion or conclusions in an argument, it'll be easier to locate the premises. Now, it's important to remember that in order to qualify as an argument, there must be at least one premise and at least one conclusion. Therefore, statements such as never trust the elderly, or I like ballet better than tap dancing, or you should drive up to the mountains and ski, or is dinner ready, are all examples of statements or questions that are not arguments. Although all arguments must contain at least one premise and at least one conclusion, most arguments consist of additional components as well. One of these additional components is assumption. Assumptions are statements that have no evidence offered, and assumptions can be stated or unstated, in which case they are implied. One quote I really like from Lemony Snicket is, quote, making assumptions simply means believing things are a certain way with little or no evidence that shows you are correct. And you can see at once how this can lead to terrible trouble. Assumptions certainly can get us into trouble, particularly when we're unaware that we're making assumptions. I want to point out the difference between a stated or an unstated assumption. Quote, more people have bought La Baroness automobiles than any other American car. This includes an unstated assumption. Can you figure out what it is? The unstated or applied assumption here is that when a large number of consumers make a choice, it's a good choice. Now, quote, more people have bought La Baroness automobiles than any other American car. When so many people agree, it must be the right choice. Now the assumption is explicitly stated. With that said, it's still an assumption because it's stated without any justification. Next, subarguments. Subarguments are the smaller arguments or the subpoints that are used to build towards the main argument. Qualifiers are constraints or restrictions on the conclusion. Essentially, they're conditions under which the conclusion is supported. We talked about qualifiers when we talked about circle diagrams in an earlier lecture presentation. Qualifiers include words like all, none, and some. While those are examples of qualifiers, qualifiers in terms of arguments do not need to be simple terms. For example, in a passage about college-level testing, quote, "If it is not related to the subjects taught in a college curriculum, then it will not be a valid measure of college-level learning." Here, the qualifier is the limiting condition that says that the conclusion is only valid when the assessment is related to curriculum. So for example, if you had to take a test to graduate college, if that test had questions about high-level physics and you had never taken a physics course, that would not be a good measure of your learning in college. The qualifier, therefore, is that the test is only a valid measurement of what you gained from the curriculum if it actually reflects the curriculum that you followed while you were in school. That is, each student would need a slightly different version of the test for it to be valid for everybody. Counterarguments are statements that refute a particular conclusion. Counterarguments are essentially arguments on the other side. So if you are arguing in favor of a certain concept, the counterargument are the alternative side, the arguments that support the other perspective. When counterarguments are relatively weak, the conclusion remains unchanged. But when there are very strong counterarguments, it can detract from the persuasiveness or the quality of the original argument. Arguments are evaluated according to three main criteria. The first is to actually make sure that it's an argument. So there needs to be at least one premise and one conclusion. After that, we need to look at the acceptability and the consistency of the premises. Acceptability is usually judged on a continuum from totally unacceptable to completely acceptable. We'll talk more about acceptability as well as consistency on the next slide. The next criteria for evaluating an argument is the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Lastly, we need to look at the unseen parts of an argument. We need to ask ourselves what's missing and reflect on how that missing material might be important in terms of the argument. On the next few slides, we'll go through each of these criterion separately. First, acceptable and consistent premises. Premises must be acceptable, and by acceptable, we mean either factually true or reasonably believed to be true. Much of what we believe to be true comes from expert statements, as well as from personal, common, or shared knowledge. For example, we take as factually true that the sun is hot, that germs cause illness, and that California is bigger than Oregon. In a good argument, the premises must also be consistent. When there are inconsistencies, it's important to eliminate the weak inconsistencies and then judge the strength of the total argument from there. Part of assessing acceptability is that we have to determine credibility of our sources. It can be difficult to assess credibility, but it's a very important aspect of determining what we should be believing and how we should be evaluating various arguments. Some questions you might ask to assess credibility include, is the author a recognized authority in the field? Do they have credentials to support that? What is their background? Is there some reason why this person should be perceived as an expert or as someone whose material is particularly credible? Is the author an independent party, or do they have something to gain? What methods of analysis were used, and are these valid? Keep in mind that it can be difficult on some topics or with some subjects to determine who might an expert be. For example, who's the expert on euthanasia? Some other things you might look for. Do they have any first-hand knowledge of the issue? Does the author state the goals for the publication? Is the author's affiliation reflected in their materials? Is it meant to persuade, advocate, inform, or sell something? Is there only one point of view? And does the author acknowledge bias? Are there facts and arguments from all sides of a controversial topic? Is the language meant to arouse emotions? Does the argument support the mission of the affiliation? Are there benefits to the organization if people agree with the arguments that are presented? Are opinions disguised as facts? Are conclusions supported with evidence? And are the assumptions reasonable? I encourage you to consider these points when you're evaluating your materials for your topic analysis paper. You can also find more information about evaluating credibility in this week's video, Evaluating Sources for Credibility. Those of you who like to pause the lecture presentation to view a video might do so now. The second criteria for evaluating an argument is to assess the relationship between the premises and the conclusion or conclusions. The first step in doing this is to determine the structure of the argument. Let's look at 4 different argument structures. First, the simple argument. In a simple argument, the premise holds up the conclusion. There is generally, in a simple argument, simply one premise and one conclusion. In a convergent structure, 2 or more premises converge on the same conclusion. That is, 2 or more premises support the same conclusion. In a chain structure, the conclusion of one sub-argument is the premise of the next sub-argument. That is, the premises do not converge on the same conclusion, but instead, the premise supports another premise, which supports another premise, which at some point supports a conclusion. Separate arguments refer to just what it sounds like. 2 or more arguments in the same passage. To be separate arguments, there must be at least 2 conclusions. Adequate grounds refers to premises that effectively support the conclusion. Some structures are more supportive than others. For example, in a simple argument, the premise provides direct support. Now, in terms of a table, imagine a tabletop being supported by one leg. It's possible there are pedestal tables that are very effectively supported by one very large table leg. However, if that table leg is relatively weak, the weight of the tabletop will collapse. And that's the perfect analogy for argument structure. One premise can be enough if it's very strong, but a single premise that is weak is unlikely to hold up a conclusion. Convergent structures are inherently strong, and that is because there are already at least 2 premises that support the conclusion. When it comes to a convergent structure, no matter how weak each additional premise may be, it adds additional strength to that conclusion. Now, back to the table analogy. If you had 2 relatively strong legs holding up a tabletop, that could be pretty effective in balancing that weight. But imagine if you added a third, even flimsy leg that will still lend just a little bit more support to the conclusion. Therefore, no matter how weak each additional premise, it does increase the strength of the conclusion for the convergent structure. Chain structures are not like convergent structures in this way. Chain structures are only as strong as the weakest sub-argument. That's because when it comes to a chain structure, each premise is supporting another premise, not the same conclusion. If you look at the chain link picture, the chain structure is similar in the sense that if one of those links break, it breaks the whole chain. That means that the premises that are below the break do not have a chance to actually support the conclusion. Essentially, when it comes to the table analogy as a way of looking at the adequate grounds in terms of premises effectively supporting conclusions, the premises need to be related to the conclusion, otherwise the legs are in a different room than the tabletop. A few weak premises might be enough to support a conclusion. A single strong premise could also be enough to support a conclusion. Lastly, many premises, even if they are very weak, is likely to hold up a tabletop because there is power in numbers. One way of checking relatedness in terms of how well the tabletop is effectively held up by the table legs is to ask the question, does the conclusion have to be true or reasonably likely to be true if the premises are acceptable? There are no firm rules, only guidelines. So we have to keep in mind that how we judge the strength of an argument depends on what we already know about that topic, as well as our personal values and our process of making judgments. All of the biases we've discussed still apply. For example, if you were told that Marion and Engelbert had a fight this morning, in fact, they fight every day, and Engelbert is moving out of their apartment and plans to move in with his mother. Marion made an appointment with a divorce attorney. Can you safely conclude that they plan to get a divorce? Now, depending on your background and your process of making judgments, you might have jumped to the conclusion that this is enough evidence or that these premises are strong enough to support the conclusion that they plan to get a divorce. However, you might have recognized that lots of couples fight, even every day. And potentially, moving out of the apartment and moving in with his mother might be a sign that perhaps they're taking a break. Marion meeting with the divorce attorney is a pretty strong table leg. But it could be that she is seeking out information to better understand the process and is not yet at a point where there are plans to get a divorce. The last part of evaluating an argument is to look for the unseen parts of the argument. It's often the missing parts that are the most important. If you prefer to pause the lecture presentation to watch the videos, now would be a great time to pause to watch the video, What is an Implicit Premise? One way of identifying the missing parts of an argument is to advocate for the other side. That is, to look for all of the counter-arguments that might exist. Advocating for the other side of an argument is one of the best ways to think about what's missing, and it is really helpful for changing your point of view so that you don't become prey to the confirmation bias. It's also important to consider the role of unstated assumptions. Asking yourself what premises are missing or what additional information is needed that would support the opposite conclusion is a helpful way to identify stated and unstated assumptions as well as unseen parts of an argument. Next, it's important to differentiate between opinions, reasoned judgments, and facts. If you'd like to pause the recording in order to watch the videos, you might pause here to watch the video, Facts versus Opinions. When it comes to evaluating arguments, we must look at whether opinions, judgments, or facts are being used to support conclusions. An opinion is simply an assertion of preference. No reason is given to support the evaluation. For example, it may be my opinion that Lady Gaga is a great singer. In the picture, it may be her opinion that he is a bad husband, but she doesn't say why. A reasoned judgment is similar to an opinion, but it also offers a reason. So a reasoned judgment is, I like X because Y. For example, I might say, Lady Gaga is a great singer because she can sing a wide variety of songs. Now, this isn't necessarily supported by any factual statements. If factual, it's a reasoned judgment based on fact. If not, it's a reasoned judgment based solely on opinion. It could also be, Lady Gaga is a great singer because she seems really nice. That might be an opinion. Now, as far as facts go, there is some verifiable truth value to the statement. For example, Lady Gaga is a great singer with several different songs at the top of the charts and albums that have gone platinum. This offers a piece of information that is verifiable, that is, that her albums have gone platinum. In terms of media and the news, while they are obligated to report facts, their opinions and their objectives color what they report and how they report it. One great way of applying your understanding of arguments is using it to create persuasive arguments. This is a real-world application of learning argument structure and can be helpful for both writing and speaking. Before writing or making a speech, for example, it's important to make sure you know the answer to the following questions. It can also be thought of as a list of ways to change somebody's belief or attitude, or to resist change when somebody is trying to get you to change your belief or attitude. There is a list of more detailed information in your book on page 243. Let's start with the first. Be direct and explicitly state your conclusion in multiple ways. It's important to repeat your conclusion and the reasons that support your conclusion. One reason for this is that people prefer familiar positions, the mere exposure effect. It's important to provide as many reasons as you can to support your conclusion and to repeat your conclusion. You can do this by making your same point in several different ways. Repetition is really useful in aiding recall. Thus, the more readily available information will make it more memorable and will strengthen your argument. Next, state reasons that support the conclusion and provide credible sources. We've already talked about credibility. So here I'll say it's important to ask yourself, how strong are my sources? To make sure that you're providing credible sources that have the necessary expertise and are hopefully independent. It's important to use facts rather than opinions as much as possible. And if it's a credible opinion, to cite it. Otherwise, it just looks like your opinion. Next, ensure that assumptions are reasonable and explicit. In research studies, for example, the researchers must begin with an explicit definition, known as an operational definition, for all of the terms involved in the study, and in publication must be extremely explicit about any assumptions made. Next, it's important that you don't appear one-sided. One way to avoid this is to use qualifiers so that you're being explicit about the conditions under which the conclusion is true. Using qualifiers and considering counterarguments improves your credibility. Next, evaluate counterarguments and alternative explanations and conclusions. Basically, to ask yourself, why should someone not believe my conclusion? What alternate conclusions have I actively considered? It's important to anticipate counterarguments, raise them, and provide counterexamples. Anticipating counterarguments is a really powerful way of weakening the counterarguments because you'll be prepared for them. It also leaves the opposition with fewer points to make because you've already introduced the counterargument before they've had a chance to introduce it as an argument on their side. Next, incorporate vivid images that makes your points memorable. As we've discussed previously, vivid imagery helps support memory retention. Next, encourage discussion and public commitment. Discussion allows the audience to generate reasons and to own them or view them as reasons that they provided. Public commitment is a very powerful motivator because it's a kind of promise to believe or act in a certain way. One example of this in everyday life is when someone takes a reservation. The difference between "will you please call if you have to cancel" versus "please call if you have to cancel" actually results in a notable difference in outcomes. Simply by asking somebody to answer the question, "will you please call if you have to cancel," increases the likelihood that they'll feel committed to that and will do so, compared to simply telling somebody to please call. While it's not stated on this slide, don't forget to also ask yourself, what's missing? There is a line between persuasion and propaganda. Those of you who like to pause the recording to view videos could pause here to watch the video, The Power of Nazi Propaganda, to get some insight into how the Nazis used their understanding of persuasion and transformed persuasion into propaganda. Propaganda has been defined by Pratkinis and Aronson as mass suggestion or influence through the manipulation of symbols and the psychology of the individual. Propaganda is essentially persuasion taken too far and without concern for the truth. Propaganda is not necessarily a lie, but there is less concern for the truth than to the degree of persuasive power. That is, there is less concern for sound arguments. Propaganda capitalizes on leading people to illogical conclusions, and there are many approaches to doing this. One is to concentrate on weaknesses in the opponent's argument. When there's limited evidence to provide of your own, it can be effective to really concentrate on weaknesses in the opponent's argument. Next, to take quotes out of context so the meaning is altered. Sound bites are a very effective way, unfortunately, of capitalizing on this. Next, to exploit errors in the opposing argument. Often these errors are very small, but in exploiting these errors, it makes it appear that there are big errors being made and that perhaps we can't trust the information at all. Similarly, there's a tendency to recast honest debates among scholars so that it appears that they disagree on major issues when they generally don't. For example, it might be a disagreement on whether something happened on January 23rd or 24th. But the emphasis that there's disagreement makes it appear that maybe nobody really knows what's going on with this subject. Similarly, again, to focus on what is not known rather than what is known. To ask questions that make people doubt when there isn't much evidence to offer about what is known that actually contradicts with the concept or the belief that the person is trying to persuade you against. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend viewing Michael Shermer's TED Talks. This is an area of expertise of his, and he talks very openly about how these are used to support particularly conspiracy theories. This leads us to the topic of points of logical vulnerability, something we have discussed before when we talked about bounded rationality. Essentially, points of logical vulnerability are topics we have trouble remaining objective about or remaining logical about. Advertisements and other visual arguments prey on this vulnerability. However, the effects are difficult to gauge because they're often subtle, and we're often unaware of the impact. We don't scrutinize visual arguments nearly as closely as written and verbal ones, and the media knows this and uses this to sway public opinion and to increase demand for products. The media has a heavy emphasis on controversy for ratings. It's much more interesting than points of agreement. Another way that this is capitalized on in terms of demand for products would be to know that a headache commercial with a man in a white lab coat stating the drug works fast on pain appears as more of an authority figure, when in fact, maybe just an actor discussing an opinion. Might not even be the actor's opinion, but it's an opinion consistent with the conclusion that that product owner would like you to come to, which is that this product is superior and you should purchase it. Logical fallacies, which are often referred to as simply fallacies, are unsound reasoning techniques that are used for the purpose of persuasion. They are common errors in reasoning that undermine logic. They are often used as unsound reasoning techniques for the purpose of persuasion, and again, we're often unaware that this is happening. We'll discuss some common logical fallacies on the next slide. For those of you who like to pause the recording to watch the videos, you should pause here to watch the video, The Art of Rhetoric. The following are some sample logical fallacies. This list is not exhaustive, but does include some of the more prominent logical fallacies that undermine our ability to reason effectively. Let's start with rationalization. Rationalizing is effectively selectively attending to and/or gathering information that favors a preferred conclusion. It involves rating counterarguments as weak because they detract from the preferred conclusion. Rationalizing can be considered both a logical fallacy and a defense mechanism. An example of rationalizing would be when people are presented with political affiliations, from liberal to conservative, with information about diabetes. There were 4 conditions in this study. 1, a control condition, in which no information about the cause of diabetes was presented. 2, a condition that discusses genetic basis. 3, a condition that discusses the way individual life choices affect diabetes. And 4, a condition that discusses how social variables affect diabetes. The authors of this study found that people with more socially oriented political beliefs, that is, liberals, were more likely to believe that social determinants were important in causing the rise in diabetes, regardless of which version they read in the study. They were also more likely to endorse restrictions on junk food as a way of reducing diabetes. Participants in this study used their pre-existing biases to interpret new information and derive conclusions that were consistent with their pre-existing political beliefs. What does this remind you of? Hopefully, this brought to mind the confirmation bias, which is a similar phenomenon. Next, association effects. Association effects are when 2 events that occur close together in time and/or space form some sort of association. 2 of the more common association effects are guilt by association and virtue by association. Guilt by association is when an individual comes across as guilty because of the people they associate with. For example, a child who spends a lot of time around other children who maybe get in trouble often might be seen as a troublemaker even though that child does not generally get in trouble, or at least does not generally engage in behaviors that should get that child in trouble. Virtue by association is essentially the opposite of guilt by association, whereby an individual seems more virtuous because of their association with someone or something else. For example, when presidential offices have been held by family members, it tends to reflect positively on people who are going for other types of offices as well. Arguments against the person is sometimes referred to as name-calling, because essentially you're attacking the person who supports the cause rather than the cause itself. This is also known as ad hominem. One example of this is that the Nazis believed that the theory of relativity was wrong because Einstein was Jewish. They didn't attack the theory of relativity per se. Instead, they attacked Einstein and everything that Einstein stood for or had developed. Another example of arguments against the person are asking female rape witnesses about their sexual history or the number of partners that they've had or what they were wearing at the time that they were attacked. This information suggests that that person was doing something to somehow bring upon the rape, that it was about the person involved, rather than placing blame where it is deserved on the perpetrator. Arguments against the person try to disprove the person rather than the idea they support. Appeals to pity or pride. An example of appeals to pity is the Sarah McLachlan SPCA animal commercial that I'm sure many of you have seen. The idea is help is needed, there's an underdog or somebody who needs our help, and because we feel sorry for these people, we should jump to action. Appeals to pride use praise or flattery to help motivate somebody towards a certain conclusion or behavior. I get these often. Emails that start with, "Dear Dr. Lewis, you are just the solution we've been looking for." And then if you scroll down to the end of the email, there's invariably something being sold. Popularity and testimonials. Popularity is based on a need for conformity, and testimonials refer to endorsements. Popularity is also known as the bandwagon effect because it relies on the need for conformity for its persuasive power. Essentially, if everyone's doing it, it must be right. Again, familiarity is very powerful. A false dichotomy is when issues are reduced to only two positions, and there's no allowance for other alternatives or for combinations of ideas. Because of this, it's also referred to as the simplification or the black and white fallacy. An example would be to ask, would you prefer that government cut spending or increase taxes? Of course, it's probably a combination of those two approaches that would be most effective. When faced with a false dichotomy, it's helpful to ask what is good and what is bad about both ideas, rather than asking if the ideas are good or bad. Card stacking involves omitting important information that might support an unfavorable view, and it's also known as suppressed information. Essentially, you leave out the variables that don't fit your argument. An example might be a car advertisement that compares itself to another car and stresses that their car has better gas mileage and costs less, but leaves out which car needs more repairs or has more comfortable seating or accelerates better. Lastly, circular reasoning refers to when a conclusion only restates the premise. For example, we need to raise the speed limit because the current legal speed is too low. So we need to raise the speed limit because the current legal speed is too low. So that's why we need to raise the speed limit. You can see when it comes to circular reasoning that even when it sounds compelling, usually because we agree with it, it doesn't really provide a reason to support the conclusion.